Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. In this video, we're taking a look at the enteric nervous system, which is the nervous system of the gut itself. But not only that, we're also going to take a look at what we call the extrinsic innervation of the gut, meaning the way our central nervous system, specifically our vagus nerve, can also influence our gastrointestinal tract functions. Let's take a look. All right, to begin, I want to focus on the enteric nervous system itself. So let's write up here enteric nervous system. And when we think about the enteric nervous system, what you need to think about is the mini brain, which is often what it's referred to. Now, the reason why it's referred to as the mini brain is because the enteric nervous system has around about 100 billion neurons. That's as many neurons as you're going to find in the spinal cord. So that's the reason why we call it the mini brain. Its job is to regulate the function of the digestive system. And what are the functions of the digestive system? Well, it's to not only digest and absorb, but also to secrete. So it's going to secrete enzymes and hormones, but also motility and movement. So we need the enteric nervous system to do this. Now, in order to understand the enteric nervous system, we need to understand the various layers of the digestive system. So what I've drawn up here, this telescopic looking image, is our digestive tract, or to be specific, the alimentary canal, the hollow tube that goes from the mouth all the way down through to the anus. And you see that there are 7 main layers to it. Let's take a look at these layers because we need to understand them to know where the enteric nervous system resides. So we're going to start from inside out. So you can see this is the hollow lumen, or the hollow inside of the digestive tract. And this layer is made up of epithelial cells. Remember, your body's made up of 4 major tissue types: epithelium, connective, muscle, and nervous. I'm going to show you all 4 types going through this tract. So this internal layer is epithelia. Now, what do you know about epithelia? Well, you know that epithelia lines hollow organs. There we go, epithelia. This epithelia also changes as we move through from the mouth down through to the anus. Sometimes you have stratified squamous, many layers of squish cells. Sometimes you have simple cuboidal or columnar. Anyway, that's another lecture. Underneath the epithelial layer, so underneath epithelia or epithelium, we always get connective tissue. And we often call the connective tissue underneath epithelium the basal lamina. The basal lamina. And we know that connective tissue has a number of things, right? So connective tissue often has blood vessels. It often has lymphatics, for example. So we've got some lymph here, just to highlight. Make it look a little bit more colorful. All right. Underneath the basal lamina, what you're going to find is the next layer. And this layer we call the muscularis mucosa. What a great name. Muscularis, meaning muscle, mucosa. It's the muscle of the mucosa. Now, mucosa. All 3 of these layers we term the mucosa. Just so you're aware, all right? Now, the muscularis mucosa is muscle, and we're gonna have some circular muscle, so muscle that goes around the tube, and we're gonna have some longitudinal muscle that goes the length of the tube. And what's its job? Well, we know when muscle gets stimulated and it contracts, it narrows things, especially if this muscle is wrapping around a hollow organ, it's gonna contract it. So these 3 layers we call the mucosa. Now, underneath the mucosal layer, we have a layer called the submucosa. So this here is called the submucosa. And the submucosa is also connective tissue. But something very important that we find in the submucosa is a set of neurons, a really important set of neurons, which I'm going to draw in blue. So we've got neurons here of the submucosa. What does it do? Well, it innervates the muscles of the muscularis mucosa. It's also going to innervate the blood vessels as well of the basal lamina. It's going to innervate the mucosa as well, and it's going to tell it to secrete enzymes and hormones. So as you can see, we've got this submucosal plexus innervating the mucosa itself. Brilliant. What do you think we call this? Well, as I alluded to, while this layer is called the submucosa, this set of neurons is called the submucosal plexus. Great. Submucosal plexus. That's one part of the enteric nervous system. All right, next layer. In actual fact, the next two layers are muscle layers. We've got the circular muscle layer. That's circular muscle. And then this is what we call longitudinal muscle. Right. So let's just draw this up. For the circular muscle, it goes around the tube. It goes around. So this muscle wraps its way around the tube in this fashion. Now I want you to think, if I were to stimulate this muscle to contract, what do you think it does? If it's going around the tube and I were to tell it to contract, it narrows the hollow lumen of the tube. So it allows for us to segment food. So if I were to do this, then it segments food. That's part of motility. What about the longitudinal muscle? It goes the length of the tube. That's cool, because what do you think happens if I were to contract muscle that goes the length of the tube? Well, it's going to shorten the tube. So if I've got the tube here and the longitudinal muscle contracts, it shortens the tube. So together, we narrow the lumen, shorten the tube. Narrow the lumen, shorten the tube. That's how we move things through. That's responsible, these two muscle layers are responsible for peristalsis. This is movement in the gastrointestinal tract. Now importantly, sitting between these two layers, we've got another neural plexus, another set of neurons. And these neurons are unsurprisingly going to innervate the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle. Brilliant. And what do you think it's going to do? Well, it's going to tell this muscle to contract. We call this the myenteric plexus. Remember, my is a prefix we often use for muscle, right? So we've got the submucosal plexus, myenteric plexus, and then finally, the last layer we have here is called the serosa, which is connective tissue, depending on where you are, it's sometimes termed the adventitia, but basically it's connective tissue that anchors the digestive tract to the surrounding body and other organs. Right, but let's focus on submucosal plexus and myenteric plexus. Together, these are called the enteric nervous system. And again, let's just highlight. The submucosal plexus, its job is going to tell the mucosa, so it innervates the mucosa to tell it to secrete. It's going to tell blood vessels to constrict. It's also going to have local contraction, local muscle contraction, which allows for local movement. And then if we have a look at the myenteric plexus, its job is basically motility, right? So the myenteric plexus, its job is motility, which can include peristalsis, segmentation. So now we know all the functions of the enteric nervous system: secretion, blood vessel constriction, local contraction, and motility. Now, brilliant. What I want to highlight is how it's regulated though. So let's take these major layers. Let's take the mucosal layer, let's take the submucosal layer, let's take the circular and longitudinal muscle, and let's draw it up. So let's first start by, separate that out. We're going to start with the mucosal layer. So we're going to have a layer right here. That's the mucosal layer. Let's write it down. Mucosa. The next layer is going to be the submucosal plexus. So we've got a layer here which we call the submucosal plexus. Then the next layer is going to be the circular muscle. So we've got our circular muscle here, circular muscle layer. And remember I said between the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle, that's where we've got the myenteric plexus. So let's put the myenteric plexus here. So now we've got the myenteric plexus. And the next one's going to be longitudinal muscle. Okay. I think this is a really nice way to have a look at how it functions. So, first is this. Where are the enteric neurons? Well, we've got myenteric neurons here, and their job is to innervate the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle. How does it tell it to contract? It needs to release a neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter that it releases is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. So, in the enteric nervous system, acetylcholine is excitatory. Let's do it in another color. I think this will be a lot easier for us to get. If we do it in another color, let's do it in, we'll do it in black, and then I can do the other one in red. Acetylcholine is excitatory. So we're releasing acetylcholine here and acetylcholine here. But what we also have are the neurons of the submucosal plexus. So we've got neurons of the submucosal, and what does it innervate? The mucosa, to tell it to secrete, and tell blood vessels to constrict and so forth. What neurotransmitter does it release? Again, acetylcholine, because it's the major excitatory neuron. Now, in addition to that, the myenteric plexus can speak to the submucosal plexus. So there's a conversation had. That's why cumulatively it's called the enteric nervous system. And again, it will release acetylcholine. Wonderful. Now, it's not only an excitatory system telling those things to happen. You can have inhibitory signals, because remember, in order for food or foodstuffs to move through the gastrointestinal tract, you need peristalsis, which is contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation. And when food moves through, and I'm going to do a whole lecture on motility, when food moves through, it triggers the part of the digestive system in front of it to relax and the part behind it to contract. So we need signals for relaxation or inhibition. So these signals come from not acetylcholine, but two other major peptides, which is nitric oxide and vasoactive intestinal protein. These are inhibitory. So nitric oxide and vasoactive intestinal, I may have said inhibitory, I'm sorry. Vasoactive intestinal protein. So, vasoactive intestinal protein, nitric oxide, they are inhibitory. And what do? Well, they can get released at any one of these points. NO and VIP, NO and VIP, NO, VIP, NO, VIP. So often they are released in response to local signals in the mucosa from receptors picking up things like stretch, and then it goes through and it can relax so food can move through. All right, we've looked at the enteric nervous system. We need to have a look and see how the extrinsic nervous system, because this enteric nervous system you could also call the intrinsic nervous system, or you could call it local reflexes. Sometimes textbooks refer to it as these, so might as well pop them in there. Okay, let's have a look now at the extrinsic. Let's write it up here, extrinsic. Or known as long reflexes of the gastrointestinal tract. All right, so we've got, just to orientate, because I know I'm a great drawer, but let me just tell you what I've drawn up here. That's the brain, that's the cerebrum. We've got the cerebellum there, and we've got the brain stem, and we've got the spinal cord. So, we're gonna look at the brain stem and the sacral region. We're gonna look specifically at the medulla, right there, and the sacral region. Why? Because the parasympathetic nervous system, which we call the rest and digest system, it exits at the medulla and it exits at the sacrum. So let's draw this up. We're going to have neurons coming out of here out of the medulla, and these neurons are vagal or vagus nerves, which we know is cranial nerve 10. Now they're going to come out. Now what they do is they will innervate areas like the pharynx and the esophagus and the stomach and the duodenum and the small intestines and most of the large intestines, around about the first 2/3 of the large intestines. That's the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve innervates the vast majority of the gastrointestinal tract. But we've got the last third of the colon, and this comes from the sacrum. And it's, like I said, going to innervate the final third. So let's write let's write this up. This is coming out of the medulla. This is coming out of the sacrum. That's the pelvic nerves. That's the vagus nerves. I buried the lead there. This is pelvic nerves. Pelvic nerves. All right. Vagus nerves, pelvic nerves. Brilliant. Now, what are they innervating? They don't directly innervate the tissue. They innervate the enteric nervous system. So, to put it simply, let's draw up a vagus nerve. And what's it going to do? This vagus nerve is going to enter, and it's going to innervate the myenteric plexus. So let's write this up. This is a vagus nerve. So this is coming from the medulla, and it innervates the myenteric plexus. If it wants to excite it, which often it will release acetylcholine. Now, not only does it innervate the neurons of the myenteric plexus, it can innervate those of the submucosal plexus. And again, excite it to release acetylcholine. Perfect. Now you might be thinking, what about this sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system? It does innervate these organs, but its job is mainly inhibitory, unless it's going to the sphincters, which are the areas that sort of segregate between structures. So sphincter here and a sphincter here, and you're going to have a sphincter here, for example, and you're going to have multiple sphincters here. They're often innervated by the sympathetic nervous system to tell them to constrict. But most of the time, the sympathetic nervous system is just inhibitory. And remember, it comes out of the thoracic and lumbar region. So it's going to come out of this area here. And it goes to, remember, it goes to the paravertebral ganglia. So I'm just going to broadly draw that up. And then it's going to go out, and again, it's going to innervate basically the same structures, right? Now, this isn't an anatomically correct, this is a conceptually correct drawing. So that's just highlighting, yes, the sympathetic nervous system does innervate. So for completion's sake, how does it do it? Well, if we were to just draw the enteric nervous system up exactly as we did it before, so you've got an enteric neuron here innervating the circular muscle, innervating longitudinal muscle for movement, peristalsis, motility. You're also going to have submucosal plexus innervating the mucosa to tell it to secrete, blood vessels to constrict, local movement. And we know that this also speaks to that there as well. Okay, what does the sympathetic nervous system do? So not a vagus nerve here, but we're going to have a sympathetic nerve, sympathetic neuron coming in, sympathetic nervous system. What it's going to do is it's going to come in, and yes, it can talk to the neurons of the myenteric plexus. It can also talk to, actually I'll draw it over here, neurons of the submucosal plexus. But one other difference is it can innervate directly the mucosa and tell the glands to not secrete. The vagus doesn't really do that, but the sympathetic does. Now, what does it release? Well, it's going to release a signal that's inhibitory, and this inhibitory signal is noradrenaline. So it releases noradrenaline there, releases noradrenaline there, and releases noradrenaline there. And its job is mostly inhibitory. Again, unless it's at the sphincters, then it's excitatory to tell them to constrict. So, this is a run through of the enteric nervous system and the way that the vagus nerve predominantly also influences it. I'm Dr. Mike. I hope that helps.